This week's project is making something with these 4 embroidered pieces that my dad found in my late mom's stuff. I've got her whole quilting stash, and he's still finding things occasionally around the house. And this time it was this set of embroidered horses. And when we saw it, we knew exactly who she probably meant it for, her cousin. And I figured I would put it together and send it off to my great aunt, cousin, something to that effect. So the first thing I decided was that I did want to put them on point like this because I think they just look better that way, except for the bottom one. And since they're not 4 of the same things, I decided I would do a long table runner or wall hanging instead of a square wall hanging. Something like this here that I designed for it. And I initially designed it with this 6 inches across, which is what these are actually folded at right now. And they do look a little tight, but then when I tried to design it with something that was a little bigger, 7 inches across, because 7 is a prime number, it gets really hard to design something around it, and it was getting a little bigger than I thought it should be for what it is. So I decided to go with a little bit tighter around the embroidery. These are the 2 biggest ones, so I figured that if they fit, it would be okay. And I just cut this 6-inch square, and this is just to give me some lines so I know how to cut the square later. So I'm going to do the same thing with this one. This one actually might be just as big because of that big flowing mane. And if I had a 6-inch square ruler, I would just do that instead and mark it with pencil, but I don't, so we're going to do this. I'm going to do the square and a square method that is more for beginners because I don't want to stress today. So I'll show you about that. First, I'm going to cut these into a square that's the finished size plus a half an inch for the seam allowances. So the square is like here. So it's going to be a 6.5-inch square. This is the kind of thing that happens when I'm doing something new to me. I've obviously made square and a squares, but I've never actually made ones with fussy cuts in the middle, and that I was cutting, the big square first. So first I tried marking everything, and that did not work out right. So finally I have made myself a little template of my ruler. The squares that I'm cutting need to be 6.5 inches, and happily I have a ruler that is 6.5 inches square. And I've just put tape here to mark where the inside finish should be. And so originally I had this so that the horse will be like that, which works, but I'm thinking actually that I like this one better. That one's a little tight. That one's nice, but I think if we put it on point, it looks weird. I can see what happens if it's just the way it's designed. Maybe that's it. Maybe this horse is rearing. I'm going to go with that. The template definitely here makes it a whole lot easier. There is square number 1. And we're going to ignore all the little pencil markings and fold marks. So I've got my pieces. Now I need to turn these horse blocks into these blocks here with the triangles on the side. And to know how big to cut these, there are lots of charts out there. but basically the formula is half of the finished size of the square plus a half an inch. You can see in my notes here that originally I was thinking about doing the harder method of doing square and a square, but I've decided on the easier one, which means that for each of these, I need to cut 4 3.5-inch squares. So the first thing is to decide which fabric to use. I have to pick fabric for these triangles and then for also all these squares, which I think are going to be a mix of things, and then a border as well, and of course a binding. The binding, I'm already pretty sure, is going to be this black because I think that it will pick up the black in the embroidery nicely to have that around the edge. And then I just picked out a bunch of browns from my mom's stash. Who knows what she would have picked. But I need something for the squares that's going to have enough. These aren't generally my colors, but somehow it reminds me more of horse riding and this relative of mine. I haven't seen her for a very long time. Saw her more when I was a kid. So many fabrics to choose from. These are the fabrics I've ended up picking. I don't know about you, but I can't actually think about fabric and talk at the same time. But I'll explain why I picked what I did. These all seem to me to go together. Here that the brown didn't quite go as well in my head. This seemed a little too contrasty. And this was sort of the wrong orange, so it does kind of go in here, right? But this is what's going around the horses, and this is pretty bland. I was a little worried that this would be too busy, so I did check to see they're going to be in 2-inch squares. And that still looks okay to me with the 2-inch squares, but I didn't want to cut it big enough to be the triangles. That's why I picked something fairly basic to set off these. This one was in the running, but then when I did the 2-inch square, it definitely still has a distinctive line on it, and I didn't want that. My quilt, my choice. So I'm going to cut all the pieces now and be right back. So here are my pieces. Here's all the little I've got the center here with the triangles around the edge, and then all these little pieces I've cut are these. I'm going to wait to cut the border that goes around the edge because if you've noticed, I have changed a couple of the fabrics and I'm still playing around. So I will wait to see what it all looks like before I decide to put the border on, what color it should be. I'm going to get started with making these square in a square pieces. What you do to do this is you line this up like this. Put another one on here, this side. Now there's something I've been thinking about with these corner to corners because I just for another quilt did a whole bunch of little tiny corner to corners. Sometimes they don't quite come out. Like they're not even. So I'm going to try by being very precise. First I'm going to mark this line. Then I'm actually going to sew a little bit to this side of that line, just like it's a scant 1/4 inch to see if that helps make this turn out better. In any case, if it makes it a little bigger, it's easier to trim off than it is to create more fabric. I'm going to stick a couple pins in. So I'm a big fan of pinning. I'm going to do that with all of these, and then we'll go to the machine. Now these ones without corners, again, it doesn't matter because the seam is going to be inside that, but I do want to match up the sides here. If I match up these two sides, it'll just be like matching up the corner if it had existed. It's good to be gentle when you're marking on these diagonals. Use something that marks fairly easily so you don't stretch things. You can see that if I were to push really hard on this, it might stretch the diagonal out of shape. Okay, again, I'm going to sew just to the outside of this seam, just like if I were sewing a scant 1/4 inch. So if I have anything I have too much rather than too little, and it's not, it's really just the needle width. It's that it's coming down just to the right of that. The difference between scant 1/4 inch and 1/4 inch is so tiny and picky. Just getting it makes everything a lot less stressful later. I was going to see how I was doing, but my line is so faint I can't see it. Now, normally you would cut off this excess now before you pressed. I'm going to press first just because I want to make sure everything turned out right in terms of how it's fitting next to the embroidery. You can see that this is not quite lining up with this, and that's what I mean with square and square can be hard sometimes. It's one of the reasons I like to do it the easy beginner way instead, because I feel like because we're protecting the bias in this method, it just makes it a little easier to get things accurate. Looks like they're all fitting nicely. So far, I'm going to do the other side. First, I'm going to trim off the extra on the back here, and then we'll sew the other side on. Some people like to use their rotary cutter to do this, like this. I actually like cutting with scissors, but I can see that this way might be a lot faster if I had a whole bunch of them. Okay, we're going to do the exact same thing with the other corners now. Now, obviously, I could mark these squares at any point. I don't have to mark them when they're already placed. You're doing two opposite corners and then opposite corners because then you can sew over these seams here. Okay, we'll sew these sides and press them and be right back. Okay, we have our pieces and I've trimmed off some of this extra black so I don't forget to do it before it's time to quilt it because those would probably show through. I like these two. I've got to say I'm not so pleased with this one and I'm already thinking about what sort of quilting I might do to beef up the bottom here. That was a tough one when I was laying it all out. It even has some, these have some extra threads on the front as well. She didn't have an embroidery machine, so I'm really kind of confused as to where she got these. The next step is to lay these all out with these little squares around it. Now, if I was doing a big quilt, I would have done some strip piecing and cut some squares from the cut pairs of squares from strips that were already pieced together. But this is small and I'm not really sure exactly what I want to do, so I'm going to lay it out next. I usually spend a lot of time agonizing over this, but I think this time I'm just going to go for it and see what happens. What I have been thinking about is what to do with the fact that this is, I don't like it. Um, and I'm thinking, I have grand ideas right now that I'm going to do some quilting that brings this mane down here, sort of expands it beyond the block. Hopefully that will help. I don't know. And also I have to figure out whether I can actually do that with the quilting or not. So next step is to assemble all this. And we're just going to do that quick like this. Okay, so that's more like 90 minutes later. And now it's time to decide which of the two borders I want. I'm going to remember that that is what I'm thinking I'm going to do the binding in. Though I will tell you that probably for the majority of the 90 minutes, I worried about this block and what I'm going to do to make it look more balanced with the quilting. Still haven't quite come up with a plan yet, but let's compare what I think of the two different border fabrics. It's kind of funny for me to think that you're probably sitting on the other side of this saying, oh, this one, that one, this one. Actually, I went and had lunch and I came back again and decided I didn't want to put a border on it. I couldn't really decide on a width of a border. And finally, I just got down to this side and I said, let's just make this the binding. Then we're almost done, except for all the quilting that I have to do to somehow make myself happy with that. I often do cut and make the binding before I actually do the quilting, just because then I don't have to worry about leaving fabric out for it. Looks like it's 32 inches long by, we're going to round here. Looks like it's almost 33 inches long and almost 11 inches wide. 33 plus 11 is 44. So 44 is half of this, and then times 2 is 88. That's the whole thing. Then you want to add 10 inches for joining, and you want to divide that by 38 or 40 to get how many strips you need, because the length of the fabric that we're cutting the strips from is about 40 inches wide. And I do that on my phone that I'm filming with. So hold on. So I did the math on my phone. I'm going to cut 3 strips, 2.5 inches wide. That's how wide I like to make my binding. I have a husband who could have done all that math in his head. I've never been able to do math in my head. There is quite a lot of math in quilting, but you don't have to do it in your head. Looks like it's time to change my rotary cutter blade. This is not ideal, but at least it's just the binding. I also have to decide whether I want to use this particular fabric for the back as well. It's got all these wrinkle marks in it. I think I'm going to wait on deciding the backing fabric until after I pick the thread color, which will be up in a little bit. First, I'm just going to make this binding though. I grew up sewing clothes, not quilts. So I always had I always had, the bias binding that you buy in the store. It was really cool to me when I started quilting and learned that you could make binding out of any fabric you wanted to. Just going to fold this in half. So we'll just gather this together neatly and it'll be ready for after we've quilted the quilt. The next step is to figure out what sort of thread I'm going to use on that top. Okay, I got 4 potential threads out from my stash of thread. You can tell right off the bat that this is the wrong kind of brown, so we'll go down to here, and what I find works best is to take a whole bunch of thread off and put it on the quilt. This is very white, but if I decide that I want to do a bunch of quilting within these blocks, this would definitely be the right choice. I like this one better than this one. This seems to blend in better. I guess what I really have to decide now, I like this. I have to decide whether I'm going to do something quilting wise with this horse. And that's going to take overnight probably and some time on my iPad. I will take a picture of this quilt and then draw on the picture of the quilt on my iPad to try out different quilting designs. But if I'm going to use this as a thread on the front, I'm going to pick out a backing that it's going to match with, which is not the rest of this fabric, but it will blend nicely and hide itself in this fabric. So I'm going to cut a backing for this. I'm going to be quilting this on my long arm, so I need it to be bigger than you would if you were quilting it on your domestic machine. There's my backing, and I'm going to go search my leftovers for a batting that's the right size. Then we'll go off to the long arm and load this up. You do not need to have a long arm in order to quilt your quilt, especially one this size. This is like complete overload, but I have one and it's fun to quilt on it, so I'm going to use it. But something this size you could definitely quilt on your regular old home machine. If you're making your first quilt and it's a big top though, I would definitely consider sending it to a long armor to do, just because it's a lot to put a big like throw size or bigger quilt through your regular machine. It's just sort of a pain in the neck, and if it's your first quilt, I want you to make another one, not be annoyed by the whole process and never make another one. So that is how the batting will go. I'm not going to start quilting yet because I haven't got a design, and I also might need to mark my top, so I'm not even going to load it on, but I'm going to check to make sure everything fits. So as I've talked about, I really didn't like the way this one turned out in terms of it being balanced with the other ones. So I decided I was going to quilt in a horse. I guess like a ghost horse or something like that you'd call that. So I took a picture of the quilt, then I superimposed over it a line drawing um, that I found on the internet of a horse rearing that seemed like it would fit in with this horse. You can see the head here is a little bit different on the other horse. And then I just traced out, I changed it a little bit in order for it to fit my design. The horse is going to be sort of standing right here on that and rearing up. I will sew along it on my long arm after I've traced out lines that I can later wash out. So first step is to trace that on. Could be kind of difficult. I'm thinking I might actually do it upside down because sometimes not being able to really understand what you're tracing helps you do it accurately. So I'll be honest, right now, this feels like it's going to be a complete and utter train wreck. But I'm going to keep on forging ahead. I'm trying to be careful and think about what I'm doing instead of just forging ahead too fast, trying to take some time and think about things. But I'm going to quilt this, I'm going to quilt the outlines, and I'm also going to do some dense filler quilting right around the outline of the horse. I think that might make it pop out a little bit. And the border is just going to be a piano key like border here. And there's going to be a little lighter filler here and a lighter filler in there. Probably just meander because I'm not that good at other kinds of fillers and I just want to get this done in time to take it where it's supposed to go. I have yet to find a really good way to attach my phone to my long arm in order to show you what I'm doing as I'm quilting. And in addition, as you can tell, I can barely talk. So there's going to be big jumps, but I'm going to tell you what I'm doing and then I'll show you after I've done it. My first consideration was I did consider for a while whether I wanted to add a second layer of batting so that this horse would pop a little bit more. But since I'm not real thrilled about the horse, we're not going to accentuate it any more than it already will be. The next step is, since I'm using two different colors of thread, one for the cream areas and another for all the other of the areas, I wanted to think about which thread I wanted to use first and stabilizing the quilt. I've decided I'm going to start with this thread. I can stabilize the quilt around the edges with this, obviously, because that won't show, just around the edges. I can baste it on, and then I can quilt around these first and do the part of the horse that's on that. And then I'm going to think about how stable I feel the quilt is, whether I can do the intense quilting in here or whether I'm going to have to come back and do that after I've done some more stabilizing of some of the other spots. Probably I'm going to change threads twice. But first I'm going to get started with this. Okay, I've done the stitching around the horse inside this, and I've done the stitching around all these squares. So I've stabilized enough of this. Now I'm going to change threads and start on the rest of the quilting that's going to be done in the other color. First with the horse and then all the other ditching and extra um, lines here. I'm going to make the piano key border. Okay, so I've got all the ditching done now. So everything is stabilized. So if I want to, I can quilt these in the middle and they won't necessarily pull the quilt in. And now I just have to decide what I'm going to do about the quilting. Part of me is just ready to be done. I think that's probably because I'm not feeling well, but I've done a lot of thinking about this. You can see I've done a lot of practicing over here on the edge. So I finally decided on the plan, which was sort of the plan to begin with, which was around the rearing horse. I'm going to do a tight stipple, just really close to it, just to bring it out a little bit, especially here on this where it's starting to go into the background. And then maybe around these as well. I'm going to consider what else I might do. I might be done at that point. I do have this block here though that I'm not so sure of. There's part of me that's thinking about doing some cross hatching through this and then doing matching cross hatching on these after I do the edge stitching. Before I started this stippling, I noticed this. This is like my top thread and my bobbin thread don't actually match. This is sort of like the story of my day-to-day quilting this quilt. But at least I'm pretty sure that this color will blend into the back just as well as this one would have. And you can't really see. I've got a good tension here, so you can't see that the threads differ. I'm calling it done now because it just needs to be done. I'm going to pop on the binding and send it to the wash and see what happens with this. So here's the finished quilt. It's actually been through the wash 3 times because the pencil that usually washes out very easily, probably because it just got caught up in the threads. It just took a little while to wash out of these little things here. So this is a well-washed quilt. You can tell it shrunk up a little bit. The body of the horse came out a little better than I expected. I still wish that this had been able to be centered instead, but I got creative and it's okay. And here are the other horses. Thanks for watching. I certainly learned a lot of new things on this quilt, and I'm glad I did do some experimentation. Happy sewing!